The desert does not forgive mistakes. It burns, blinds, and buries everything in silence, men, machines, and ambitions alike. Yet in 1942, beneath the pitiless North African sun, two armies prepared to decide the fate of an empire across that endless wasteland of sand. It was here, near a small railway station called El Alamein, that one of the most dramatic confrontations of the Second World War began to take shape. The hot wind carried not only dust but destiny, as two generals, one daring and instinctive, the other methodical and unyielding, moved their forces into position for a battle that would change the course of history. At the heart of this confrontation stood Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man the world had come to know as the Desert Fox. His reputation was one of genius and daring, a commander who seemed to think faster than his enemies could move. Since early 1941, his Afrika Corps had swept across the sands of Libya and Egypt like a storm, defeating larger forces through speed, deception, and audacity. Rommel was admired even by his enemies. His soldiers adored him, and his opponents feared him. Every move he made seemed unpredictable, every victory effortless. By mid-1942, the British Empire's position in North Africa had reached a breaking point. Rommel's armoured columns had pushed deep into Egypt, and the British Eighth Army had been driven back, demoralised and weary from months of retreat. If Rommel succeeded in capturing the Suez Canal, he would cut Britain's empire in two, severing its lifeline to India and the East. From there, Axis forces could seize control of the oil-rich Middle East, a prize that could fuel Hitler's ambitions indefinitely. But the British were not ready to surrender the desert. Their backs were against the wall, but the wall this time was made of sand and steel. In July 1942, at a point roughly 100 kilometers from Alexandria, they halted their retreat and dug in near the narrow coastal strip of El Alamein. The choice of ground was deliberate. The Mediterranean Sea guarded one flank, while the vast Qattara Depression, an impassable sea of soft sand and steep cliffs, protected the other. Rommel's tanks could not outflank them here. The battlefield had natural limits. For once, the British would not be outmaneuvered. But they needed something more than luck. They needed leadership, and that arrived in the form of a man as different from Rommel as night is from day. General Bernard Montgomery took command of the British Eighth Army in August 1942. He was not loved for his warmth or charm, but he was respected for his discipline and confidence. Where Rommel trusted intuition, Montgomery trusted preparation. He believed that wars were not won by brilliance alone but by organization, morale, and relentless planning. When he arrived, the British troops were exhausted, their spirit broken by months of defeat. Montgomery's first task was to restore their faith not only in their commanders but in themselves. He promised them no easy victory, but he made one promise clear: there would be no more retreat. The British would stand at El Alamein, and this time, they would win. Meanwhile, the Axis forces, though fierce and battle-hardened, were beginning to feel the weight of their long campaign. Rommel's army was a patchwork of German and Italian divisions stretched across hundreds of miles of desert. Their supply lines ran thin, constantly harassed by Allied bombers and submarines. Fuel and ammunition were running dangerously low, and the constant desert heat wore men and machines alike to the bone. Rommel, though still as cunning as ever, knew his advantage was slipping away. The desert that had once favored his mobility now threatened to trap him. But retreat was unthinkable. His orders from Hitler were clear: advance, no matter the cost. Both commanders prepared in silence as the desert waited. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with dust and anticipation. Soldiers on both sides repaired tanks, checked rifles, and wrote letters home, knowing that something immense was coming. Allied aircraft prowled the skies, photographing enemy positions and striking at supply lines. Engineers laid thousands of mines, creating deadly belts that crisscrossed the sands, a landscape so dangerous that even the wind could not erase its menace. The locals called these zones the Devil's Gardens, and soon, they would earn that name. Montgomery was determined not to rush. He waited until his forces were ready, until every tank was fueled, every gun in position, every soldier trained for what was to come. He gathered men from across the empire: British, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, South Africans, united by one mission: to stop Rommel. Day by day, more equipment arrived: trucks, tanks, aircraft, the material proof of an empire's determination to survive. By October, Montgomery had built a force of over 230,000 men and 1,000 tanks, supported by overwhelming air power. For the first time in the Desert War, the Allies would fight on their own terms. Rommel, meanwhile, watched the build-up with grim resolve. His own numbers were far smaller, and his supplies continued to dwindle. Every gallon of fuel had to be fought for, every shell accounted for. Yet, despite the odds, he remained confident that his troops' experience and his own instincts could overcome Montgomery's methodical style. The Desert Fox still believed that speed and surprise could win the day, and he planned to strike before the Allies could unleash their full might. But illness struck him down at the worst moment, forcing him to leave the front temporarily for treatment in Germany. In his absence, his weary army faced an enemy that was gathering strength like a desert storm. As October 1942 began, the signs of change filled the air. Allied bombers roared overhead almost constantly, softening Axis defenses. Supply convoys from the Mediterranean brought fuel and ammunition to British lines. The men, once uncertain, now felt a strange confidence building, a sense that something was shifting in their favor. The desert winds carried the smell of oil, dust, and anticipation. Soldiers stared toward the horizon, where the heat shimmered like a mirage, knowing that soon, the calm would end. In the distance, Montgomery stood over his maps in a dimly lit tent, marking the enemy's positions with careful precision. He had decided when and where the attack would come. He called the Operation Lightfoot, a name meant to remind his men that only those who moved lightly through the minefields would survive to carry the fight forward. It was a plan built not on daring gambles but on slow, crushing pressure. The desert would be his chessboard, and Rommel's army his opponent's final pieces. As the sun dipped below the horizon on October 23, 1942, a strange stillness fell over the desert. The stars began to appear, faint and flickering in the dry air. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. The night exploded in a thunderstorm of artillery fire. Over 1,000 Allied guns roared to life in unison, lighting up the darkness with flame and fury. The ground shook, the air burned, and men on both sides clung to the earth as the bombardment rolled across the dunes like a living beast. It was the beginning of the Battle of El Alamein, the clash that would decide who ruled the desert and, perhaps, the direction of the entire war. In that first night of chaos, one truth became clear: the age of Rommel's unstoppable advance was over, and a new tide was rising in the desert. The Empire's shadow had begun to stretch once more toward victory. Operation Lightfoot, the roar of the desert. The desert night was alive with fire and fear. What had seemed silent and endless moments before suddenly erupted in a roar that shook the sand beneath every soldier's feet. On October 23, 1942, the British Eighth Army unleashed a barrage of artillery unlike anything the North African desert had ever seen. Thousands of guns fired in precise, calculated waves, illuminating the dark dunes with flashes of hellish light. The operation, codenamed Lightfoot, was designed to crush the Axis defenses at El Alamein, but its success would depend on discipline, patience, and sheer endurance. The men of the Eighth Army moved forward under the cover of this roaring storm, crawling over rocky ridges and through fields of barbed wire. Every step was dangerous. The sand itself seemed alive, hiding mines beneath its surface like a trap waiting to claim the unwary. Tanks rumbled behind the infantry, their engines growling as they prepared to exploit any breach in Rommel's defenses. Engineers worked tirelessly, cutting paths through minefields while shells screamed overhead. Soldiers could barely hear each other over the chaos, yet they pushed on, knowing that the fate of the desert and perhaps the war itself hung in the balance. Rommel's men, meanwhile, fought with desperate courage. Even in the Desert Fox's temporary absence, his seasoned officers organized counterattacks, positioning anti-tank guns and machine guns to slow the Allied advance. The Axis line was formidable, stretched over miles but held together by the will of those who knew that any mistake could mean death. As the night wore on, British soldiers felt the full weight of the challenge. The enemy did not break easily, and every yard of sand gained was paid for in blood. Shells struck without warning, mortars buried their victims in clouds of dust, and the screams of wounded men echoed across the dunes. For those in the front line, the desert had transformed into a nightmare, but one that must be endured. The strategic brilliance of Montgomery's plan lay in timing. He knew Rommel's forces were low on supplies and that they could not sustain prolonged fighting at full strength. The artillery barrage was meant to pin the Axis soldiers, destroy fortifications, and clear paths through the minefields for the tanks that followed. Each explosion, each flash of light, served not only to weaken the enemy physically but to erode their confidence. Montgomery had studied the desert, the enemy, and his men for weeks. He understood that victory here required patience. Rash assaults would only play into Rommel's talent for rapid, unpredictable strikes. Allied pilots added to the chaos from above. Aircraft flew low over the battlefield, strafing enemy positions, bombing supply depots, and creating a psychological pressure that Rommel's forces had never faced in such intensity. The desert became a theater of complete war, land, sea, and air acting in concert. Trucks loaded with ammunition and fuel navigated treacherous terrain under constant threat, bringing desperately needed support to men and machines in the line of fire. The Eighth Army's coordination was a testament to Montgomery's meticulous planning, and yet, despite these advantages, progress was painfully slow. For days, the battle settled into a grinding rhythm. The infantry advanced cautiously, tank units pushed forward only where cleared, and the desert swallowed the sounds of victory and defeat alike. Each minefield was a test of nerve, each ridge a potential death trap. Men fought not just the enemy, but exhaustion, hunger, and the unrelenting sun that returned with daylight. Nightfall offered no relief, darkness concealed enemy positions and made navigation treacherous. Soldiers learned to trust their training, their leaders, and each other in ways that only a war of attrition could teach. Rommel, upon returning to the front after a brief absence for health reasons, faced a stark reality. The Allies had gathered strength beyond anything he had anticipated, and their careful build-up threatened to overwhelm his stretched lines. He organized counterattacks with what forces he had, sending tanks and infantry into the gaps that Montgomery's forces had yet to fill. The Desert Fox relied on speed and surprise, maneuvering through small windows of opportunity, but his supply lines were under constant bombardment, limiting his ability to sustain such assaults. Every move was a gamble, every decision carried the weight of potential disaster. The clash of tanks became a central drama in the struggle. British armor advanced in tight formations, moving cautiously over the cleared paths through minefields. Axis tanks countered with deadly accuracy, creating explosions that flung men and metal into the sand. Each destroyed vehicle was a reminder of the high cost of desert warfare. Artillery positions, camouflaged within ridges and dunes, unleashed torrents of fire that forced attacks to stall and soldiers to regroup. The desert floor became a landscape of ruin, dotted with twisted steel and the silent testimony of men who had fallen in the line of duty. Despite the chaos, Montgomery's plan began to yield results. The minefields, though lethal, were systematically breached, and the infantry secured footholds closer to the Axis positions. The artillery continued its relentless pounding, and Allied aircraft harried Rommel's columns, cutting supply routes and weakening defensive positions. Every day, the Desert Fox's forces felt the tightening pressure, their options narrowing. Speed was no longer enough to overcome the Allies' overwhelming preparation. Slowly, the tide of the desert began to shift. The psychological dimension of the battle was as significant as the physical one. The Axis soldiers, trained and experienced though they were, could sense the inevitability of change. Nights filled with explosions and gunfire eroded morale. Rumors of reinforcements for the Allies circulated among Rommel's ranks, sowing doubt. The desert, once the arena of Rommel's brilliance, now became a prison that choked the movement and initiative he relied upon. Montgomery, in contrast, used every day to bolster his men's confidence, speaking to officers and soldiers alike, reinforcing the idea that victory was not a matter of chance but of preparation and courage. By the end of the first week, the initial shock of Operation Lightfoot had achieved its primary objectives. Paths through the minefields allowed British tanks to maneuver where previously impossible. Allied forces held their positions and repelled Axis counterattacks, demonstrating that the Eighth Army could stand firm. Yet the battle was far from over. Rommel's ingenuity and determination ensured that every inch gained would be contested, and the desert, harsh and merciless, allowed no respite. Soldiers slept in the open sand, tended the wounded under fire, and scavenged what supplies they could, knowing that the next day could be their last. In the hearts of those fighting at El Alamein, a shared understanding emerged: the desert would not yield, the enemy would not surrender, and only the disciplined, determined, and relentless would survive. Operation Lightfoot had begun to turn the gears of war, but the larger struggle, the full test of endurance and strategy, still lay ahead. The roar of artillery, the flash of burning tanks, and the endless waves of men moving through the sand became the rhythm of this historic fight, a rhythm that would echo in history long after the last bullet had been fired and the dust of the desert had settled. By mid-October, the first phase of the battle had revealed the stark realities of desert warfare. Success required not only bravery but calculation, victory demanded organization and timing. The Desert Fox, brilliant as he was, faced an enemy who had learned from past defeats, adapting to the desert and mounting a force that could finally challenge his dominance. For the British, every moment of struggle was a step toward redemption, every yard gained a testament to patience and planning. And beneath it all, the desert watched silently, vast and indifferent, holding within its dunes the fates of men and empires alike. The Desert Fox strikes back. The morning sun rose over El Alamein, casting long shadows across the dunes, and with it came the unrelenting roar of war. The first phase of Operation Lightfoot had shaken Rommel's forces, but the Desert Fox was far from defeated. If the Allies thought the tide had fully turned, they underestimated the ingenuity and desperation of a man whose very reputation was built on daring and audacity. Rommel's mind raced like a spring wind across the desert, calculating, anticipating, plotting the counterstrokes that could yet change the course of the battle. By mid-October, the Axis forces were on the defensive, but Rommel refused to accept mere survival. His supply lines, constantly harried by Allied aircraft and artillery, were perilously thin. Fuel and ammunition were scarce, tanks could not be pushed too far without risking immobilization, and infantry required daily reinforcements to hold their lines. Despite these limitations, he saw opportunity in the overconfidence of the enemy. Montgomery's meticulous preparation had slowed the British advance, but it had also created predictability. The Desert Fox knew that patience alone would not save him, only bold, decisive action could. Rommel launched a series of counterattacks designed to puncture the British lines. Using the limited armor and infantry at his disposal, he struck at weak points, concentrating his forces in small, sudden bursts of violence. The desert itself became his ally and adversary. While it provided open terrain for rapid armored thrusts, it also exposed his tanks and troops to the relentless Allied artillery. Each assault was calculated to achieve maximum impact with minimal resources, and yet the cost was severe. Tanks burned, soldiers fell, and the roar of engines was punctuated by the screams of the wounded. Despite these losses, the Desert Fox's strikes caused moments of chaos and confusion among the Allies, forcing Montgomery to divert forces and adjust his strategy. Montgomery, however, remained calm. He had anticipated Rommel's ingenuity, knowing the Desert Fox would attempt precisely such maneuvers. Reinforcements were moved strategically, artillery positions recalibrated, and aerial reconnaissance intensified to track enemy movements. The British commander understood that the desert did not favor rash action and that every misstep by the Axis could be exploited. His patience and discipline became the counterbalance to Rommel's unpredictability, and slowly, a subtle shift in momentum began to emerge. The Allies had survived the first shock of the counterattacks, and they were learning to fight the Desert Fox on his own terms. The counterattacks brought horror to the soldiers on both sides. Infantry advanced under fire, tanks collided in bursts of flame and smoke, and the desert was littered with the detritus of war. Mines tore through vehicles, artillery shells shattered fortifications, and men were forced to fight not only the enemy but the harsh environment. Water was scarce, food rationing strict, and exhaustion a constant companion. Night brought no relief, darkness concealed danger, and the roar of engines and the flash of guns continued unabated. The battle had become a grinding, unrelenting test of endurance, courage, and willpower. Rommel's tactics were brilliant yet constrained by circumstance. He relied on speed, surprise, and the experience of his troops to exploit any lapse in British coordination. Small groups of tanks would strike quickly, attempting to sever supply lines or isolate infantry units. Engineers would clear paths or set traps, while artillery fired rapidly to support the attacks. Each move was precise, designed to create disruption, but the British defenses had grown stronger, more resilient. Montgomery had learned from previous encounters, he had reinforced weak points, trained his men to react swiftly, and built redundancies into his command structure. The result was a battle of nerves, wits, and endurance as much as brute force. Amid the chaos, the human element of war revealed itself. Soldiers wrote letters in fleeting moments of quiet, shared cigarettes across trenches, and whispered prayers into the wind. The desert, vast and indifferent, bore witness to acts of courage and desperation alike. Stories emerged of small units holding ground against overwhelming odds, medics braving fire to save the wounded, and pilots flying with daring precision to protect advancing troops. These moments, invisible in the grand strategy, shaped the morale of armies and became the heartbeat of the battle. Despite the intensity of the counterattacks, Montgomery's strategy began to show results. The minefields cleared during Operation Lightfoot allowed tanks to maneuver and support infantry effectively. Axis positions were increasingly isolated and targeted by combined artillery and air strikes. Rommel's forces, stretched thin and running low on resources, were forced to fight each engagement at a disadvantage. Slowly, inch by inch, the British began to reclaim territory that had once been lost. Every yard gained in the desert came at a terrible cost, but the sense of momentum grew. Soldiers began to feel that victory, long elusive and abstract, was tangible. Rommel realized that time was running out. His bold strikes, though tactically effective in isolated instances, could not sustain the broader campaign. The Allies' supply chains remained strong, their forces steadily reinforced, and their morale high. Even the Desert Fox, whose audacity had so often carried the day, could not overcome the relentless pressure applied by Montgomery's methodical planning. Desperation seeped into his calculations, forcing riskier moves and leaving his already fragile lines vulnerable. The desert, once a playground for his brilliance, had become a stage of constraint. The turning point approached in the final week of October. Allied forces launched concentrated attacks against the weakened points in the Axis lines, exploiting every advantage gained over the previous weeks. Tanks rolled forward through cleared paths, artillery pounded positions with unrelenting precision, and infantry surged across the dunes, reclaiming lost ground. Rommel, recognizing the limits of his situation, shifted to a defensive posture, ordering his men to hold at all costs. The battle had reached a critical juncture. The momentum that had sustained him for months in the desert was finally faltering under the weight of strategy, resources, and coordination. By the end of the month, the Desert Fox's counterattacks had failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. While individual actions showed brilliance, the broader picture was clear. Montgomery's careful preparation, disciplined forces, and superior logistics were gradually gaining the upper hand. The battle was far from over, but the tide had unmistakably turned. What had begun as Rommel's attempt to reclaim the initiative had instead exposed vulnerabilities that the Allies could now exploit. The desert, indifferent yet unforgiving, had claimed its toll and signaled a shift in the war's momentum. El Alamein became more than a battle, it was a test of endurance, strategy, and human spirit. Soldiers endured relentless heat, sandstorms, and the omnipresent threat of death. Commanders balanced audacity with caution, improvisation with planning, and risk with discipline. Every movement, every decision, carried weight not only for the immediate engagement but for the larger war effort. In this crucible, the Desert Fox confronted a new reality, that even brilliance could be constrained by preparation, persistence, and relentless pressure. As the first hints of November dawned over the desert, it became clear that a new chapter in the North African campaign was beginning. The Axis forces, battered but not destroyed, regrouped and prepared for the inevitable next phase. The British, buoyed by success and hardened by months of struggle, stood ready to press their advantage. The desert, silent and eternal, awaited the next clash. And in the hearts of those who fought at El Alamein, the understanding deepened: victory in this wasteland was possible, but only for those willing to endure, adapt, and seize the fleeting moments that defined history. Breakthrough and retreat, the turning point of the desert. The desert erupted in fire and steel as dawn broke over El Alamein on November 2, 1942. For weeks, the sands had swallowed men, machines, and dreams alike, but now, the decisive moment had arrived. The British Eighth Army, bolstered by relentless preparation and hardened resolve, unleashed a concentrated assault that would determine the fate of North Africa. The air was filled with the roar of artillery, the rumble of tanks, and the cries of men committed to a battle whose scale and intensity no words could fully convey. Montgomery had waited for this moment with meticulous patience, knowing that timing, precision, and coordination would be the keys to victory. The breakthrough came in waves. Infantry surged forward across the cleared minefields, their boots sinking into the burning sands. Tanks advanced in tight formations, shields against the Axis guns, while aircraft swooped low, strafing enemy positions and disrupting supply lines. The desert, a silent and indifferent witness to months of conflict, now bore the unmistakable marks of a turning tide. Every explosion, every charge, every movement of men and machines contributed to a force so overwhelming that the Axis lines began to buckle under the pressure. Rommel, the Desert Fox, recognized the danger too late. His forces, already exhausted and under-resourced, could not withstand the intensity of the British assault. Supplies were nearly exhausted, fuel, ammunition, and food were in short supply, and communication lines had been disrupted by constant bombardment. Every counterattack he attempted was met with preparation and resilience, turning bold moves into costly failures. The desert, once a theater where he had maneuvered with genius, now constrained his options and amplified every weakness. The battlefields of El Alamein were a landscape of chaos and heroism. Tanks burned, leaving trails of blackened steel across the sand, while artillery shells created craters that became temporary graves for the fallen. Soldiers waded through smoke, dust, and fire, driven by discipline and fear alike. Medics moved from one scene of carnage to another, performing miracles under unthinkable conditions. In the air, Allied pilots executed daring maneuvers, attacking supply columns and intercepting Axis aircraft, ensuring that the enemy could not regroup. It was a total war, a clash of strategy, endurance, and willpower in one of the harshest environments imaginable. Montgomery's brilliance lay not just in planning but in the psychological warfare that accompanied it. Each success reinforced Allied morale while weakening the Axis determination. Soldiers learned that their progress, though measured in yards, was inexorable. Each fortified position captured, each ridge secured, chipped away at the Desert Fox's confidence and reduced the space in which he could maneuver. The desert, vast and impassive, now seemed to favor those who had adapted, organized, and endured. The realization that victory was within reach inspired soldiers to push beyond exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Rommel's retreat began as a calculated necessity rather than panic. He understood that preserving his forces was critical for future engagements. His men dismantled artillery, destroyed equipment that could not be carried, and fell back toward positions further west. The retreat was fraught with peril. Allied aircraft harried columns, artillery struck stragglers, and the desert itself slowed movement. Yet Rommel's leadership remained formidable, orchestrating withdrawals with discipline that prevented a complete collapse. Even in retreat, the Desert Fox demonstrated tactical genius, ensuring that his army lived to fight another day, though the battle for El Alamein had decisively shifted. The human cost of the breakthrough was immense. Soldiers on both sides endured unimaginable suffering. Wounded men lay in the sand awaiting aid, entire units were decimated in minutes, and the roar of engines and guns drowned the cries of the fallen. Yet amid the carnage, stories of bravery emerged. Infantry held positions against overwhelming odds, engineers cleared minefields under fire, and pilots risked their lives to protect advancing troops. These acts, small and personal, became the backbone of a victory that depended as much on human courage as on artillery, tanks, or strategy. By mid-November, the Axis forces had fully withdrawn from El Alamein, leaving behind wreckage, depleted supplies, and a desert scorched by war. The British victory was more than tactical, it was symbolic. For the first time in the North African campaign, Rommel's aura of invincibility had been broken. The desert, once dominated by the Desert Fox's brilliance, now stood witness to the triumph of preparation, coordination, and perseverance. Montgomery's meticulous planning had transformed the Eighth Army from a cautious force into a decisive one, capable of holding, exploiting, and turning advantage into irreversible success. The strategic implications of El Alamein were profound. The victory halted Axis momentum in North Africa, securing the Suez Canal and vital Allied supply routes. It bolstered the confidence of Allied nations, proving that the Axis forces could be challenged and defeated through disciplined planning and combined arms strategy. For Rommel, the defeat was a lesson in the limits of audacity when faced with preparation, coordination, and the relentless pressure of a determined enemy. The Desert Fox retained his skill and reputation, but the myth of his invulnerability had been shattered. In the weeks following the battle, the Allied forces consolidated gains and prepared for the advance across North Africa. The desert, stripped of its Axis defenders, became a stage for logistics, reinforcement, and further operations. Soldiers repaired vehicles, treated the wounded, and prepared for the inevitable challenges ahead. The victory at El Alamein was not the end of the war in North Africa, but it marked the turning point, the moment when the balance of power shifted irreversibly. El Alamein entered history as a testament to endurance, strategy, and leadership. Montgomery's patient build-up, the coordinated assault of infantry, armor, and air power, and the resilience of the soldiers on the ground combined to achieve a victory that echoed far beyond the desert. Rommel's retreat, while disciplined, symbolized the limits of even the greatest tactical genius against overwhelming preparation and combined might. The sands of the desert had borne witness to one of the defining moments of the Second World War, a clash of strategy, courage, and perseverance that would be remembered for generations. By the time the dust settled, the desert held silence once more. Trenches remained, tanks smoldered, and the bodies of the fallen testified to the brutality of the fight. Yet amidst the devastation, the triumph of the British Eighth Army stood clear. Victory at El Alamein was not just a military success, it was a turning point that boosted Allied morale, halted Axis ambitions in Africa, and set the stage for the eventual liberation of the continent. In the hearts of those who fought, the memory of the battle remained vivid, a test of endurance, courage, and resolve in the most unforgiving of theaters. The desert had claimed much, but it had also revealed the power of preparation over audacity, coordination over brilliance, and perseverance over desperation. El Alamein was a victory carved from fire, sand, and human courage, a decisive moment that reshaped the course of the Second World War in North Africa and beyond.